All right, with no further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter, Dr. Kachun Yu, who is our curator of space sciences. Take it away, Kachun.
All right, thank you very much, Mitch, and welcome everyone to Digital Earth Academy, from Stonehenge to Skyscrapers. And as Mitch sort of alluded to, I am actually an astronomer here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And so I spend my time looking at data taken from telescopes which point out into the rest of the universe. But those telescopes do share some commonality with the data sets and the telescopes that we'll be using the data from, in that astronomers care about the amount of detail that they see in objects in outer space, whether it's gas clouds or other galaxies. And how much detail you can see depends on how large that object is, and also how close or far away that object is. So basically, the further away something is, the less detail you can see. The bigger it is, the smaller detail you might be able to see. And those factors will also play a really important role in us figuring out what we can see from space. So let's go ahead and take a look at the open space software. This is being piloted by my friend and colleague, Asa. And so Asa will keep us on track. And right now we are hovering above the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And I know a lot of you are in other states, but for if you ever get a chance to visit Denver, or for those of you who live closer by, definitely feel free to drop by and visit our museum. It's located in City Park, the largest park inside of the city of Denver. You can see a bunch of solar panels off to the right in the museum. The museum has been kind of cobbled together via buildings that were built over the last century. So that's why it looks kind of complicated. But what we're going to do is, as Mitch says, we'll be viewing buildings and places as seen from satellites from space, but we'll be seeing these from different vantage points. So right now we're probably at a balloon height. So if you imagine floating in a hot air balloon, this is of the order of how high you would be and the sort of detail that you'd be able to see. You might be able to see cars in the parking lot or cars on the road, Colorado Boulevard that runs north-south, straight up and down towards the right of the image. But now you can see the whole of City Park, which is about 330 acres. There's a big lake in the middle. There's also a zoo to the north of the lake. And as we continue flying out, we're going to slowly get to where the height where airplanes fly. And now you can see downtown Denver appearing off to the left. The skyscrapers don't really show up, but you can see the shadows quite easily. And Broncos Stadium is to the left of I-25. And as we keep pulling away, we'll see the rest of the Denver metropolitan area. So Denver, along with all of its suburbs. And you can still see the grid of the streets, but now we're starting to lose a lot of the detail. And as we get up to the height of where the space station orbits, we can see the Rocky Mountains. Those are the broad kind of dark band that runs north and south, up and down. You can also see the white of the snow of some of the highest mountaintops. And we also see eastern Colorado. So that's the part of Colorado that's away from the mountains. It's more like Kansas than mountainous. But now we're seeing much of the state. We're not seeing the entire state, but we're getting at the level of what astronauts would see if you were in low Earth orbit. So now it's time for our first poll, which is just to get us thinking about what you might be able to see from space. So can you see number one? The option is farmers' fields. Second option is the pyramids in Egypt. Or third, the Great Wall of China. So for those of you in a classroom, feel free to take a quick poll of everyone in the classroom, and whichever place gets the most vote, go ahead and enter that in for the poll. And we'll leave this up for a few more seconds. And are we getting close to getting everyone's results voted in and counted? All right, so the Great Wall of China wins by the largest margin, with almost 3/4 of the vote, 73%. Farmers' Fields has the fewest, 9%, and in Egypt at 18%. So we will get to see during this program the Great Wall of China and the pyramids. But actually, before we do that, let's fly down just a little bit lower. And even at this height, you can see that there is kind of a green band that runs across the screen. And we're looking at the kind of eastern Colorado. And here, the state is more like prairie, meaning grasslands. And so a lot of what you're seeing is actually irrigated fields. And so in the American West, when farmers plant crops, they can't rely on rainfall to help water the plants. And so what they have to do is they have to dig canals and ditches to bring water to the plants from rivers. And so most of the water that we use in the Western US actually go towards irrigating crops. And if you look closely, you actually start to see patterns in the landscape. So there's more of a rectangular set of pattern towards the lower right corner, but running along the river, so that green band that runs diagonally across the screen, you actually start seeing these circular patches, so circular features that are aligned in a grid. And these are irrigated fields. And these are circular because they use a method of irrigation called center pivot irrigation, where they have basically sprinklers that are on a rolling mechanism, and the whole thing spins around. And so that way you can basically irrigate with water coming out of a pipe in the middle, and it gets sprinkled around in a circle, and that's why you have these circular fields. So each of these is about half a mile across. The larger circles are about a mile across. And you can easily see these if you're flying over in an airplane, but if you are in orbit around in space at the height of the space station, for instance, which is about 220, 240 miles above the surface of the Earth, you might not easily see the individual circles, but if you're high enough, and we can, let's go ahead and pull out, Isa. As we pull out, the individual circles might be hard to see, but you'll still get a distinct sense that there's a very regular pattern on the ground. And that pattern is due to these irrigated fields. And so as we pull away, we're gonna go ahead and march on over to the eastern half of the US, at the Great Lakes, up to the north. And what we're going to do now is we're going to fly down to see some skyscrapers. And you might already have a good guess as to where we'll be going. You can enter that into the chat, which city has some prominent skyscrapers that we can look at. And obviously skyscrapers are something that is easy to see from the ground, but we're going to take a look at what they look like from above. And yes, we have a couple of answers in the chat. You're definitely correct. We will be looking at New York City. We have Long Island, which is the island that stretches off to the right, to the upper right corner, but we're headed towards the island of Manhattan. It looks like it's attached, but there's actually the Harlem River that divides it. It's that dark line that splits it from the mainland. And as we get closer to Manhattan, we'll start seeing the city grid of New York. And so at airplane height, you can definitely see this regular grid made up of streets and avenues and boulevards. And now we're plunging towards the city, Central Park, not City Park, in New York. There's a great big lake in the center. There's a zoo in Central Park. There's white splotches to the north of the lake, above the lake, are actually baseball fields. You can actually make out baseball diamonds. And as we move south, you'll see streets and buildings. And we know New York is filled with multi-story buildings. But from this distance, and when we look straight down, you actually can't tell that they are tall buildings. And that's just because they don't look like tall buildings unless you can see their shadows. And here we can see some skyscrapers right at the edge of Central Park. And what we're going to do is we're going to find a building that's very distinctive, at least when you're on the ground looking up at it. But when you're looking down upon it from above, it might be a little bit trickier to tell what it is. And so as we fly in, feel free to enter into the chat what you think it is. But we're headed towards that building in the very center. You can see its shadow, and so you might be able to guess what the building is based on its shadow. Yes, we have one correct guess already, a second correct guess in the chat, and a third one. So I think everyone, many of the students out there know that this is the Empire State Building. We're looking at, and here it is from below at street level. As I said, it's very distinctive. It was built in the, it was finished in the early 1930s. Very distinctive Art Deco design. There's a big TV antenna at the top. And if we switch back to Lisa's view, you can see that antenna. You can also see an observation deck on the 102nd floor. So this is something that you can do if you ever visit New York, and I've done this, where you buy a ticket, you can take an elevator to go straight up to that observation deck. There are a couple of other observation decks lower down, but this is the one you really want to get to. It's surrounded by a high fence, so you feel pretty safe up there, other than in case a strong wind comes. But you can imagine looking down upon the street and seeing peoples and cars looking like ants down on the surface. And so this is, again, evidence that how we see objects from below, from the ground, is very different than the experience of someone from an airplane or someone looking from above. And in many cases, it might not even be obvious that you're looking at a tall skyscraper unless you see the shadow and unless the sun is in the right place to cast a long shadow. And sometimes it could be cloudy and you might not get a shadow at all. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and go to our next city, Asa. And again, we're going to stay on the East Coast of the United States and fly away from New York. New Jersey is off to the left, and we'll be seeing more states. But we're gonna be headed to another city with famous landmarks. Just gonna go a little bit south. See Maryland and Pennsylvania, flew past Connecticut and Delaware. And yes, people are guessing in the chat that we are headed towards Washington, D.C. The Potomac River runs past the city. And like New York, D.C. has a very regular grid. So you see lots of straight east-west and north-south lines. But you also see a lot of diagonals as well. And those are very intentional. The diagonals, as you know, Washington, D.C. is our capital. The White House is there. The U.S. Capitol, where Congress meets, is there. And a lot of these diagonals originate from the U.S. Capitol, from the White House. But what we're going to do is we're going to fly down to, you can see a green length of park that runs from left to right. That's the Capitol Mall. So that's a great mall, great grassy space that you can walk on. There are lots of museums that you can visit along it. The Smithsonian Natural History Museum is there. The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum is right off the mall, and those are wonderful places to visit. But we are flying down again to a very distinctive building or object, at least from the ground. And it's harder to tell what it is from above, but for those of you who know, it's obviously the Washington Monument, which is 555 feet, 5 1/8 inches high. And this, of course, was built to celebrate our first president, George Washington. And it's located on the mall. You can take either an elevator or if you're brave enough, you can also climb stairs to get up to the observation level up at the top. And you can look out these small windows to see the rest of Washington, D.C. And let's see, there someone requested the Lincoln Memorial, or was asking perhaps if this was the Lincoln Memorial. Well, it's not, but we will be heading to the Lincoln Memorial next. So let's go ahead and head down the west end of the mall. And we're going to head to the Lincoln Memorial. And again, it doesn't really look like much from above, but for those of you who have been to Washington, D.C., either with a school group, perhaps, or with your families, and if you've ever visited the Lincoln Memorial, you know that it's a really amazing building. This is what it looks like from the side. It's based on a Greek design, the Parthenon, and inside there's actually a giant statue of Lincoln seated, and you can read excerpts from his speeches, including the Gettysburg Address, on the inside of the walls and on the steps. A lot of historic events have taken place, including Martin Luther King Jr., who gave his "I Have a Dream" speech right on the steps overlooking the mall, with the Washington Monument and the US Capitol off in the distance. And I think we have a video with Asa and Mitch about resolution involving the Lincoln Memorial. So let's go ahead and play that video.
Things appear smaller the further away they are. Like right now, I'm about 10 feet away from my friend Asa, who looks just like Abraham Lincoln. And at this distance, his head appears to be the same size as Lincoln's head on a penny. Now, Asa doesn't really have a teeny tiny head, but it appears that way. And this is true all the time. But we don't go around saying, oh, those people have their teeny tiny heads, or look at that tree, it's so small, it's like smaller than my thumb. No, our brains use all sorts of visual information to figure out how far away things are and how big they are. Like our brains know that if Asa were to hold up a penny over where he is, it would look teeny tiny compared to my what? It's like the exact same size. Wait, what's going on? This is really weird. Is Asa's head really as small as a penny? What am I doing? Oh, it's the old giant penny trick. Gets me every time. Speaking of pennies, that building on the back of older pennies is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. If the Lincoln Memorial were here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, it would be about this big. Now, how far away do you think we'd have to go so that the actual building would appear the same size as it does on a teeny tiny penny? Maybe to that tree over there? Maybe to that other tree? Maybe to the other side of that lake? Maybe on top of that building back there? Maybe on that mountain way back there? Let's find out. Here we are at the tree. We're still too close. Now here we are at the lake. We're still too close. Here we are halfway around the lake, and finally we're far enough away that the building appears the same size it does on the penny. Now, did you know that if you look close enough at a penny, you can actually see Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial? Well, I can't. My eyes aren't good enough. But I work at a science museum where we have cool technology like this digital microscope. Using this, we can magnify the penny 200 times. And once you can look at it 200 times bigger, it's easy to see Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial. What do you think about that, Abraham Lincoln? Cool. Now can I have my penny back? Thank you. Don't throw it. Don't throw it. What? Whoa! Oh, it landed next to that tiny cell phone. How is that cell phone so small? That doesn't... Wait a second. Ah, oh, it's the old giant penny trick again. Lincoln!
All right, thanks a lot, Asa and Mitch, for helping us understand a little bit more about how resolution and how things can appear the same size, depending on how far away they are. But we're gonna continue our travels around the world. And as we fly out away from Washington, D.C. and the North American continent, and we're going to cross the Atlantic Ocean, I'm going to bring back the poll, and we're going to have a variant of that first poll question, and ask again, what man-made, human-made objects you think can be visible from space? And we'll get a chance to check on how accurate your answers are. So let's go ahead and bring back the second poll question. So what do you think can be seen from space? Can you see Stonehenge? Can we see the pyramids in Egypt? Or can we see the Great Wall of China? And so I think since you have some experience with this poll, we should be able to get this poll finished in just a few more seconds. So we have three choices, and we're going to get a chance to go to each one, and then you're going to be able to see how correct you are, how easy it is to see any of these three from space. All right, have we gotten most of the results in? Okay, all right, we have the Great Wall of China again. winning at 57%, but in second place is Stonehenge at 29%, and the pyramids are actually last. And so let's go ahead and fly to Stonehenge first. We're going to actually go in that order: Stonehenge, pyramids, followed by the Great Wall in China. And so Stonehenge is located in southwestern England. So here's the Isle of Britain. France is below it, separated by the English Channel. And we are going to fly down and try to find Stonehenge. And as we zoom in, you'll see that the landscape does look like a mosaic. It's actually very complicated with lots of different patches that have been broken apart. And those are obviously, as we come in, those are different farms. And so over hundreds, even thousands of years, the land has been subdivided by farmers. It's also, this landscape is crisscrossed by roads, which will start becoming more apparent as we fly in closer. And as we get closer, if you see Stonehenge, go ahead and leave a shout out in the chat, because as it turns out, Stonehenge is actually not that easy to see, even from an airplane. And perhaps if you're at balloon level, it might be easier to see, especially if your balloon flew right over it. But as you can tell, Stonehenge is right in the middle of the frame, but it's still not quite evident yet. We do see a road. It's actually a highway that runs east-west, and it's actually a really busy road. So you can imagine, if you lived out here and you drove to work, or you were driven to school, you could potentially drive by Stonehenge on your way to school or work every day. And here we are. Here is Stonehenge. And as we get closer, and this is like a really low balloon height, so only a couple hundred feet. Now you can make out the multiple rings of stone that make up Stonehenge. And I think we have a photo of it from the side. And so this is what a more familiar view of it looks like. But as you can see from above, it really doesn't look like much. But we do understand that the people who made Stonehenge were very knowledgeable about their landscape and about their environment, because there's another stone there. There's a bright spot off to the upper right of Stonehenge. That's another stone that's about 16 feet high. That's called the heel stone. And it's aligned with Stonehenge because if you were to stand at the location of the heel stone and look back towards the center of Stonehenge, on the shortest day of the year, December 21st or 22nd, the winter solstice, you would actually see the sun set right in the center of Stonehenge. And so this is what the view would look like from the heel stone, looking back towards Stonehenge on the December solstice, the shortest day of the year, watching the sunset. And so the builders of Stonehenge obviously understood how the sun moved in the sky over the course of the year. And they were able to align these enormous stones that weighed many tons, dragging them many tens, if not hundreds of miles into this landscape. And one of the remarkable things is that we were looking at this from space, but actually the entire environment, the landscape around Stonehenge, was also discovered archaeologically by archaeologists flying in airplanes in the 1920s, when airplanes started becoming more prevalent, more common. And so you can imagine if you were on the ground, it would be hard to see some of these features, these ditches that were dug up by the ancient Neolithic or Stone Age peoples, but they would be easier to see from an airplane. So we're going to fly over to another henge called Woodhenge, and it's only about 2 miles away from Stonehenge, but it shows you that this entire landscape has been worked over and built up over a period of about 1,000 years by those Stone Age peoples. And we might have to pull up to sort of center on where Woodhenge is. Oh, there we go. So a henge is basically a circular or oval feature where they've dug a ditch out around it, and then they pile up the dirt from that ditch to make a low wall. And so so a henge can be just has to have that. It might not have anything upright at all. But in this case, this consisted of at least 168 poles of wood that were pounded to the ground. And so we can't, the wood no longer exists, it's rotted away. They do have evidence of all of these holes. You can see cars parked on the side of the road, so people have come out to check out Woodhenge. But this is another part of the landscape that was, for whatever reason, very important to these Neolithic peoples. All right, so let's go ahead and fly out. And this is one example where it turns out it's very difficult to see Stonehenge, even when you're relatively up close to it, just because the landscape is so busy. There's so many towns and roads and different fields with lots of different geometries and shapes. So it's hard to make it out. But what we're going to do now is we're going to fly to our next destination, the pyramids, and see if it's any easier to see. So we have the, Europe above us to the north. That's the great band of green that stretches from Spain to Russia. And what we're going to do now is we're going to fly down to North Africa. Africa is the large continent with the Sahara Desert that takes up the upper third, the northern third of the continent. And we're going to fly down to the Nile River. So you can see the Nile that runs up and down, and the Nile makes civilization in Egypt possible. So Egypt obviously is in a very dry and desert country, but water from the Nile, flooding from the Nile helps rejuvenate the soil and allows huge amounts of crops to be grown. And that has allowed the Egyptian peoples over many thousands of years to have established amazing civilizations. And one example of what they have done, obviously, are the pyramids. And we're going to see how close we can get before we can see the pyramids. So we have the city of Cairo, that's kind of on the bottom right of the screen. You can see the Nile River running through the city. So if you were to go visit the pyramids, you would fly into Cairo, and Cairo's traffic is actually crazy, meaning it can take you a couple of hours to drive 30 miles. But once you get outside of the city, you can actually see these distinctive shapes that are pretty readily apparent because the pyramids are regular shapes and they have shadowed sides that make them stand out from a distance. And the landscape is all kind of brown and beige. That's because we're in the desert. And so that means the pyramids are pretty distinctive, and they can be seen from relatively high up. So here is the Great Pyramid of Khufu. As you can see, it's made up of millions of blocks. These pyramids are actually just slightly shorter than the Washington Monument. So they're basically the tallest objects in the world for thousands of years, 4,000 years before the Washington Monument was built. And I think we're going to land. Yep, he says landed us. And we're in at the middle pyramid, which is the tomb, or it holds the body or the mummy of the pharaoh Khafre. So here's the king of Egypt, or the pharaoh. And you can see what it looks like when you're standing on the ground right next to the pyramid. And there's been a lot of excavation, and a lot of the stones have also eroded from the sides. They've been picked up by people, chipped away, and used for building materials. So you can see the very top of the pyramid used to be covered in another material, in this white limestone. So only the very tip is the limestone left over, and it's also been eroded by the elements, and it's no longer white. And as we keep spinning around, I think we'll see a camel driver. And so if you go visit the pyramids, you can also pay someone to take a camel ride. But you have to be really careful because sometimes some of the more unscrupulous people will also charge you to get off the camel. So you have to pay twice, once to get on and once to get off. And I think we also have a picture of a close-up of the blocks. We can show that while Asa flies us to our next point. So you can see that, and this is from the larger pyramid, the other pyramid, the Khufu pyramid, who is Khafre's father. And if you look at the people at the bottom, you can get a sense of how big those blocks are. Those bottom blocks weigh probably about 10 tons. And they are the sizes of small cars. And so you can imagine the amount of work and effort it took to carve these blocks out of the bedrock and to haul them sometimes hundreds of miles away. So here's a no climbing sign next to some of those blocks. There are a lot of security guards and police there to make sure you don't break the rules. But I definitely encourage you, if you ever get the chance, to visit Egypt, because there are a lot of really amazing places to go see. And Asa, oh yeah, and here I am and demonstrating how you can't trust a photo, but at least here we know that the human, in this case me, is much closer than the pyramid off in the distance. So another example of what we saw in the Penny video with the Lincoln Memorial. All right, Asa, now we've flown down to another location that's very close to the pyramids, and we're at the Sphinx. And so this is another very famous monument that you can visit while you're at the pyramids. It's just a short walk away. And this is also another amazing sculpture, because this was sculpted out of a giant knob of rock that was sitting in the sand. And you can see that there's a level that's slightly higher than the back of the Sphinx. You can tell that it was sculpted. There's a big kind of pit that the Sphinx was sculpted out of. All right, with that, let's go ahead and pull out. We can point down and pull out from Egypt and head on to our next location. So you can barely make out the Sphinx. So the Sphinx is definitely a lot smaller. Although the Sphinx is about 240 feet long, so not quite the length of a football field. Definitely dominate a football field if you were to place it inside a football field, but it's definitely not big enough to be seen from space. All right, so as we are flying away from Egypt, we're going to land not too far away in another part of the Middle East. So we're going to head down towards the Arabian Peninsula. That's the large kind of big oblong landmass with the Red Sea to the left and the Persian Gulf to the right, and divides it from the Indian Ocean. And we're going to head down to the United Arab Emirates. And that's the country that forms this kind of triangular feature that sticks out into the Persian Gulf. Where the Gulf narrows, that's the Strait of Hormuz. And as we fly down, I'm going to ask to see if you notice something very distinctive that has shown up off the coast of this country. You see a bunch of small islands showing up, and they'll show up better as we fly in closer to it. And you can type in the chat what you think these islands look like, because they're definitely artificial. You didn't show up there naturally. And their islands off in the right corner are very distinctive. But we're going to fly down to this one. Yes. I have a couple answers in the chat. One, several classes have noted that we're seeing the Palm Islands. Definitely looks like a palm tree. And off to the right, off screen, we can also take a look at them later, are the World Islands. But these are artificial islands that were created by pumping sand from the bottom of the Persian Gulf. And I think we have a picture of a ship that's doing that. So the ship has a giant suction, like a big vacuum that sucks sand from the bottom of the Persian Gulf, which isn't that deep, but you can imagine it's still a lot of effort to pump up enough sand to build these enormous islands. And on the palm trunk, that comes up the bottom, you have hotels, you have huge apartment blocks. So there are actually big skyscrapers along the bottom, and then people's houses and condominiums and apartments are along the palm leaves or the fronds that are further up. So let's go ahead and pull out again, Asa, and we can just take a quick look at the world, because someone in the chat noticed the world islands as well. So there are other features that are out here, and you can see if you kind of defocus your eyes, you can kind of make out South America and North America, and Asia and Europe and Africa, and even Australia. So again, these are all made by pumping sand from the bottom, and people are buying islands and building houses or hotels in them. But since we're here, we're also going to go visit the largest building in the world, or the tallest building in the world. And we've seen the Washington Monument, which is pretty tall, and the Empire State Building. But now we're going to head down to the current record holder for the tallest building in the world. And it's actually, again, very hard to see, just because even though it's very tall, its footprint isn't very large. And so it actually is difficult to see, but it's close to these bluish lakes or moats that, that they built. And now you can kind of see this triangle of the building. It has a triangular shadow behind it. And this is the Burj Khalifa. And I think we have a couple pictures. So again, here is the kind of an erroneous view of the Burj Khalifa, making it look like the same height as a palm tree, but that obviously isn't the case. And, but I think we have another view. So this is the Burj Khalifa from much further away. And here you can really tell that it's a super tall building. It's actually 163 stories high. So it has 60 more stories than the Empire State Building. And it's over half a mile high. And there is an observation deck up there that you can travel up to and look down. And you can imagine that's an amazing building to stand up close to, or to look up at, and to look down from. But again, it's a very narrow building, and it's hard to see from space just because its footprint is so small. And so you would have better luck seeing the shadow of it. All right, I think we're in the last few minutes. So we're going to hurry on and travel to the last great landmark or monument, human-made object that we've been talking about over the last couple polls, and that is the Great Wall of China. And I think there's a lot of people who think that the Great Wall of China is easy to spot. And in one of the statistics you hear is that it's 5,000 miles long. So it stretches across a large part of China. And so you would think that it would be easy to see, but as it turns out, we're going to see if you can spot it as we get closer in. So what we're going to do is we're going to fly in towards Beijing, which is the capital of China. And we're going to see what we can see as we fly in. And the grayish region are the urban areas. And so the largest gray region towards the center of the screen is the capital of China, Beijing. And actually the first thing that's really visible is this white rectangle. And that's actually the capital airport. So that's China's main international airport. So if you fly to China, this is where your plane would land, and then you would take a taxi or train to the city center. And airports turn out to be some of the easiest things to see from above, just because the runways are a regular shape, and they tend to have a different color in the surrounding landscape. So let's go ahead and head to the center of the city, so we don't need to spend too much time at the airport. But we'll see. Looks like the software is frozen, but we'll get to the center of Beijing real quick. And Beijing has been the capital of China for at least 500 years. That's when the emperors moved the capital there, and they built the Forbidden City, which was the home of the emperor and the king of China. And that's off to the top there. So you have a city that's about half the size of City Park in Denver, but all of that was the home of the emperor, the main home, and other homes and summer residences and winter residences. But here you can, if you travel to China, this is definitely one place you would visit. There are more than 900 buildings here, and there are different temples and different palaces. There's also a very famous museum that's here. So with that, let's go ahead and see if we can find the Great Wall of China, Asa. And if you see the Great Wall of China as you're flying towards it, go ahead and enter that into the chat. and we'll see how easy it is to see. So as it turns out, the Great Wall of China does run close by to Beijing. So if you travel to Beijing, it only takes a couple hours bus ride or a taxi ride to get to one of the parts where you can climb up to the Great Wall of China. And one of the things that you learn about when you study the history of China and the Great Wall is that there isn't one continuous wall. There are actually multiple walls, and they were built at different times, and they were connected or not connected at different times. And so even though you might hear that the Great Wall is 5,000 miles long, not all of it is complete, and not all of it might still be surviving to the current day. So let's, I think we're going to zoom in towards the Great Wall. And right now, I think I see a lot of roads and highways that take tourists up to the Great Wall. And some of the bigger regions are parking lots. And so I can see the Great Wall, but I know what I'm looking at. We're headed straight towards it right now. And it's kind of the angular line that's running across the screen. And so you can see how narrow it is. It's actually narrower than a lot of the roads that bring buses up to the wall. So you can imagine it's actually going to be difficult to see the Great Wall, even from an airplane, just because there's a lot of other stuff around it, mountainous terrain that can help hide it. So now we've plunged down to a photo panorama of the Great Wall, right in the center yet, Asa, and we can tilt down to take a look at what it looks like to be up on the Great Wall. Off in the distance, you can actually see the parking lot where buses and cars park. And so even after you've gotten off the bus, you still have quite a ways to climb to get up. You actually climb through a major fortress that's along the way, and then there's other paths that take you up to the Great Wall. And as you follow the Great Wall off into the distance, you can see that it follows the ridge line of these hills, and it disappears and it reappears again. So it's like kind of like a roller coaster. So climbing it means you have to climb a lot of steps, and so you have to bring some good walking shoes in order to get to the Great Wall. All right, so let's look at one final section of the wall. And as I said, the Great Wall was built over many thousands of years by different emperors at different times. And what they would do is that they would have invaders in the north. And so after they've fended off the invaders, they might build a stretch of the Great Wall at the one place where the invaders came. And that wall might even stretch for tens of miles, but then other invaders might come from elsewhere, and they would, let's pull out Asa and go to the west. We don't want to go to the other side. We want to go to the far west. And so invaders might come to another spot where there wasn't a wall, and they might attack. And so after they fend them off, then the emperor might have to build another wall somewhere else, right? I think we might have to reorient ourselves so that we have north in the right place, because I think we've spun around completely. And so over time, over thousands of years, you had different stretches of wall appearing across China. And some of these might be connected, some of these might be connected at later times. So it took a long time. And the wall that we just visited was built by the Ming emperors over the last 500 years. And those are the ones that are in the best condition. But what we're going to do now is we're going to fly down to a section of the wall that was built about 2,100 years ago. And so this was built by the Han emperors. So this is a completely different section of the wall. And as we fly down to it, you'll see that it's the materials of the wall are also very different. So before, we saw bricks and rocks and mortar holding the bricks together to make up the wall. And let's go ahead and plunge down, Asa. Let's go down really quickly. And you can see this landscape is very different. It's a lot drier, looks more desert-like. So let's go in. And here it is. So there's a path off to the left with a fence to keep people from touching the wall. And here is one of the Great Walls. And as you can see, this isn't brick. This is actually made up of dirt and gravel and sand and twigs. And what they did was they built these kind of wooden boxes out of planks that were open on the top and bottom, and they would fill them with rock and sand and gravel and plant matter. And then they would take these big stones or blocks of wood with handles, and they would tamp down on them to create the walls. And so this is a wall that erodes much more easily. And this is one of the few sections that hasn't eroded away. So you can come and visit this, but there are sections where all that is left are just mounds of the wall with a lot of openings separating between them. And here we can even zoom in up close and take a look at the building materials. And you can see how the building materials are basically stuff found in this environment. This is a very dry area. And so they would find lots of rocks and gravel, and there would be reeds and branches from trees and other plants that they would incorporate. All right, so with that, I think we've run out of time. And I want to thank everyone who has attended this edition of Digital Earth Academy. And for those of you who have to leave to get ready for the next period or for your next class, feel free to exit. But for those of you who can stay and can stick around, we do have time for Q&A. So if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat. And Mitch, I think we've also have some questions from earlier on that were entered into the chat. And so we can answer them now too.
All right, that's right, we do. And thank you, everyone. And we do have some questions. This is going to be a tough one. How many statues are there in America?
I don't actually know. I mean, that's something you have to Google. So, but I bet there are many thousands of statues because oftentimes statues were built after wars, after the Civil War, after World War I, after World War II, to memorialize soldiers who fought in the war. So oftentimes many towns, even the smallest towns, would have a statue in their town square. So I bet there are many thousands of statues, but I don't really know the answer.
Yeah, that's probably no one knows the answer. There's probably a good estimate out there, but I don't know if anyone really knows the answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's been a big plan to count up all the
statues. So people are wondering, can you tell us a little more about why the Sphinx's nose is missing?
Yeah, there are a lot of speculations or theories as to why the Sphinx's nose has disappeared. And one story that's commonly been told is that it was blown off by a cannon by French soldiers. So Napoleon of France invaded Egypt in the early 19th century or 18th century, 19th century. And so there was a story that some soldiers got drunk or they got angry and they aimed a cannon and they blew out the nose. But it turns out that's wrong because there are pictures and drawings of the Sphinx that predate the invasion of Egypt by France. And they show the Sphinx's nose to be missing already. And but there are some historical records to show that there is evidence that it was destroyed by someone who was angry at the villagers who lived nearby the Sphinx. And they were praying to the Sphinx for a better harvest. And this other person was angry that they're praying to this kind of pagan symbol. And so he destroyed the nose of the Sphinx to force them not to do that anymore. So that's currently the best story that we have that seems to have some evidence because it was written down by an Arab historian many hundreds of years ago.
All right, very cool. And by the way, if you have any questions now, feel free to put them in the chat and we will follow up on that. And so that's a great question. Does anyone know where the nose is?
Since the nose was probably destroyed 500-600 years ago, it's been lost. It was probably broken up into rubble when they smashed it apart. And a lot of the rock from the pyramids and from the other monuments in Egypt were probably carted away by people to build walls, to build houses. And that was also the case for the Great Wall of China too. So the Great Wall of China, the part where a lot of tourists visit, those parts were actually renovated by the government to make them, make them places where people can hike and walk on. But before they were renovated, the stones were falling apart, the bricks were falling apart, all from the elements, from the weather, from wind and water and rain and erosion. And so as it fell apart, people would cart off the pieces and to use them to build their homes. And and for a long time, a lot of these places weren't thought of as being amazing places for us to preserve and to upkeep. And it's really only been in the last century, or even the last couple of centuries, where it's been recognized that we should try and preserve these places as much as possible.
And I just want to take a quick moment to plug here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Later this month, we have a new exhibit about Egypt opening. So if you can make it down, please come and visit us. And related to that, we have a question: what culture made the pyramids?
Well, Egypt has had a culture that extends back 8,000 years, and the Egyptian kings or the pharaohs would basically conquer surrounding lands and add them to their kingdom. And so Egypt at certain times consisted of various parts, where the Egyptian kingdoms would consist of various parts of Egypt that were along the Nile. And there were different so-called dynasties of pharaohs, meaning different lines or families of kings of Egypt. And the dynasties that made the pyramids that we see in outside of Cairo, I think were part of the 5th or 6th dynasties. And so these pyramids were actually constructed over a period of anywhere between 75 to 100 years. So only a couple of generations. But there were other dynasties that constructed earlier pyramids. So there are about 100 pyramids total in Egypt. The current set of pyramids that we're seeing are the biggest and the best known ones. So it turns out that all the other pyramids and even the later pyramids were much smaller. And after a period of time, the pharaohs of Egypt didn't care to construct pyramids anymore. And so their tombs were actually buried in the ground. And so there are other places in Egypt where you can see the tombs of the kings, and you don't have to go into a pyramid to see them. You just have to crawl through a tunnel into the ground.
Wow, that's very cool. So I don't know if you heard about this, but someone had a question: was there a sinkhole near Stonehenge recently? Did you hear anything about that?
I hadn't heard about any sinkholes, but I mean that could be the case. So in Stonehenge, I mentioned that there are, a henge is basically any oval place where they dug a ditch and they piled up that dirt into a low wall. And so you can have a Stonehenge, you can have a Woodhenge, you can have other things that are henges that don't have anything in the center. And so over time, the landscape has been covered. Farmers have tilled the fields, they've plowed the fields. And so a lot of those structures have been buried. But as we saw, some of these structures are noticeable from above, from airplanes or from balloons. And you can even notice that the landscape is different depending on how crops grow. So if you imagine you've dug a ditch in the land and you've covered it over, well, that ditch is, the soil is deeper than it is elsewhere where there isn't a ditch. And so plants might grow slightly better there, or they might grow greener there earlier than plants elsewhere because the roots can grow longer. And so I can definitely imagine that there'd be certain things happening to the landscape, like sinkholes, just because the landscape has been worked over for many thousands of years with people digging ditches to build mounds and henges and to build grave sites, etc.
Cool. And so this image we're looking at right now, why are there different colors of green in those patches?
Well, I suspect, there are different fields, different farmers planting different crops, which were planted at different times. So, crops are planted often in the spring, but you might wait a few weeks for one crop versus another. They might germinate at different times of the year, and they might have different growth rates. So there can be lots of different reasons why the fields might look very different from one plot of land to another.
Very cool. They make a cool geometric pattern. So we also have a question: can we see the Bermuda Triangle? And what is the Bermuda Triangle?
Yeah, so the Bermuda Triangle, if we zoom out to look at the Atlantic Ocean on the eastern, um, just to the east of North America. So Asa is going to zoom out, and the Bermuda Triangle is actually just a region that's defined by the tip of one tip of the triangle is the southern edge of Florida, and then the other tip of the triangle is Puerto Rico, which is to the east of Cuba and the Dominican Republic. And then the third tip is the island of Bermuda, which is just above where Asa's cursor is, up to the upper left or upper right. And Puerto Rico is actually off the corner. It's off screen. You have to zoom out. You're too close to see Puerto Rico. And yeah, so Puerto Rico is just below your cursor. It's that small island, kind of rectangular island right there. And Bermuda's off to the upper right. And then so you can form a triangle between Puerto Rico and Bermuda and the tip of Florida. And the Bermuda Triangle came about because people thought they noticed that there was a rise or an increase in the number of unexplained missing planes and ships in this part of the Atlantic Ocean. But people who have really studied this issue by looking at the records show that there aren't any more missing ships or planes than there are in other parts of the ocean, or at least, because, in the end, traveling through the ocean can be very dangerous, especially if you don't have radio, which was the case in the 19th century. And even there are a lot of famous cases of missing planes or boats in the Bermuda Triangle. And if you actually investigate the circumstances in which they happened, it turns out that bad weather was often the probable cause for them to go missing. So basically, until very recently, traveling in the ocean, across the oceans, has always been somewhat hazardous or dangerous.
All right, so it's just dangerous because the ocean is dangerous.
It is.
That makes sense. So we have another question. Why did the people in Dubai make those islands fun shapes? And why did they make the islands at all?
Well, I think they made the islands as a way to draw people to live in Dubai and to buy apartments and condos there. The United Arab Emirates and many people of you out in the audience know that that area of the world has a lot of oil and gas. And so Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have gotten rich because there's a lot of oil and gas there that they've sold to others around the world. And they also know that oil and gas won't be around forever, either because eventually run out, or we have to stop drilling because of climate change. And so they are trying to figure out ways of continuing to make money. And so it turns out that some of the largest shopping malls in the world are in this part, or in Dubai and the Emirates. And Dubai is the city where the Burj Khalifa is in, is actually one of the biggest tourist destinations in the world. And people from all over Asia, from Europe, from the Middle East, from Africa, all fly there to have a vacation there, just like people in the US might fly to Las Vegas or some other place where people go and visit. And so the people here are basically turning their country into kind of like a tourist destination, someplace where people want to go and want to live, and having these islands building off the coast, making them into fun shapes, so that you can buy an island and build a house and be the island of Australia. That is something that some people in the world really much want to do. And so they want to make it really enticing to people who have the money to do this.
All right, very cool. And so we are at 2 o'clock. So I think that's about the end of our program. Thank you very much for joining us. And Kachun, you had a few.
Yeah, my only other thing I want to say is, again, thanks to everyone who were able to join. And we do have another Digital Earth Academy event on March 8th, I think. And it's about the world of extremes. So every sort of extreme environment that you can think of, the highest places, the hottest places, the coldest places, the most acidic place is. So definitely join us again in March for our next Digital Earth Academy. And thanks to Mitch and Asa and Kim and Tim who are behind the scenes for making this program work. Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone. Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day.